Welcome to the Radiation Safety Part 2. This is Rules and Regulations, Guidelines for Safe Use, which covers 10 CFR 35 and the other miscellaneous regulations. So 10 CFR 35 covers the medical use of byproduct material. It has several subparts from A through N. Of course, the first subpart A is the general administration, which includes the definitions, things like that. And then, of course, M and N are the last part of it and cover reports and enforcement, including jail time and fines and things like that. I do want to point out that Part I and Part J are reserved, so they are kind of blank. It's not really something that even applies. So just know that those are there. They're kind of placeholders. So 10 CFR 35, the first part of it covers uptake, dilution, and excretion studies, which is diagnostic nuclear medicine, where there is no written directive. The second part is imaging localization studies for diagnosis, which includes diagnostic nuclear medicine. Of course, procedures where there's no written directive. The third part is unsealed sources for therapy. This covers all of our nuclear medicine therapies and procedures that would require a written directive. 4 doesn't really apply to us that much. It's sources for brachytherapy. There are some places that are at least handling or where the breast seeds and things like that are handled by the nuclear medicine department, so it would include that. Sealed sources for diagnosis and sealed sources for therapy are in parts 5 or 0.5 and 6. And then the last part is other medical uses. So first we'll talk about subpart A. Like I said, that just covers like the definitions, the purpose and scope, all of the miscellaneous administrative stuff that goes into it. So 10 CFR 35 is the part that contains requirements and provisions for medical use of byproduct material and for the issuance of specific licenses authorizing the medical use of material. I do want to point out it also says that 10 CFR 35 also has requirements and provisions in 19, 20, 21, 30, 37, 71, 170, and 171. Remember that 10 CFR 19 is our simplest and kind of most vague, and it mostly says, you know, there's postings and notifications for workers, and you have to be safe. 20 is a little more specific with postings and dosimetry and radiation safety. And then 35 gets even more specific with the equipment that's used, as well as the human use and the actual imaging use of radioactivity. So subpart B addresses the overall administrative requirements and oversight for facilities that have a license to use nuclear medicine or, you know, radiation for diagnostic or therapeutic purposes. And so the first part of that, 35.24, talks about the authority and responsibilities of the radiation safety program. Remember, earlier parts said that you had to have a radiation safety program. This is where it details who's in charge of that program, which the responsibilities always fall on the RSO and the authorized users at the end of the day. And then the radiation protection program changes how to notify the RSC or NRC who makes those changes, things like that. The next one is the overall supervision of the license and the radiation safety program. 35.4 covers written directives. 35.41 is the procedures for administrations that require written directive. So those parts go hand in hand, and that really addresses where we find information on our therapies. And then 35.49 is the suppliers for sealed sources and for medical use. 35.5 and 0.51 and 0.55 kind of go together as well, as does 35.57. Well, all of those do. 59 does as well. All that has to do with training. So first one is training for the radiation safety officer. It details who's qualified to become a radiation safety officer. The next one is who's trained to be the authorized medical physicist. Next one is training and qualifications for the nuclear pharmacist. And then that last training is training for experienced radiation safety officer, teletherapy medical physicist, authorized users, nuclear pharmacist, and authorized nuclear pharmacist. So all of that has to do with qualifications, training, and then that last one there is how recently the training could be done. So all of that stuff in B is important to us and covers really, like I said, the administrative requirements for overseeing a radiation protection program or any kind of department where radiation is used or stored. I'll go into a little bit more detail about it. So 35.24 is the authority and responsibilities for radiation protection programs. And it really just says that licensees shall appoint a radiation safety officer. That radiation safety officer has to be qualified and approved. They also have to agree in writing to be responsible for implementing the program. And then the radiation safety officer has to ensure that the radiation safety activities are being performed in accordance with the regulatory requirements. So that's really just saying the RSO is the person that's in charge of everything and responsible for just the overall use of the license and the oversight, making sure that there's regulatory compliance. And that person has to agree in writing to say that they're willing to do that. So really it says that in the same part, it still has to do with the authority and responsibilities of the radiation safety program. And it just says basically that the RSO must be given sufficient authority, time, and resources, as well as management prerogative. And this is a really important regulation because you'll find sometimes that there is a butting of heads between management and the RSO, where the RSO is saying things have to be done a certain way because they're regulatory compliance, and then administration of the hospital does not want to do that for whatever reason. They want to do things their way, or they want to do things because of maybe budget implications or something. And sometimes they try to run really thin on resources. And so they'll have the RSO doing other jobs as well, like a lead tech who's also an RSO, but then they don't give them sufficient time or resources or the freedom to do the RSO position. So this is a really important regulation here that just supports the RSO's ability to do their job. And it says that it is the RSO's prerogative to identify radiation safety problems, initiate, recommend, and provide corrective actions, and then stop unsafe operations and verify that corrective actions were done. The RSO's best defense here, if they're in a situation like that, is to make sure things are documented well and filed so that if there is an inspection, inspectors see that radiation safety regulations are not being followed, they can at least prove as the RSO that they have attempted to do those things. And then at that point, it falls on the institution who will be liable for not for this exactly regulation right here, not allowing the RSO to do their job. So licensees that are authorized for 2 or more different types of byproduct material must have a radiation safety committee. And the Radiation Safety Committee's job is to oversee all uses of byproduct material. The committee must include an authorized user, the RSO, a representative of nursing, a representative of management, and the committee may include other members of the licensee considers appropriate. Best practice would have a representative from each of the modalities. You'll see that most hospitals have to have a radiation safety committee, and so that will be made up of an authorized user who is typically a radiologist, but it's a physician that's listed on the license, the RSO, representative of nursing, representative of management, and then usually a representative from at least one or more or all of the modalities. All right, so remember in part 20, it says that you must have a radiation safety program. There must be a plan for review and it must follow ALARA. Part 35 is where it says that the RSO's the one that's responsible for implementing that radiation safety program, and only authorized users requiring a written directive must establish a safety committee. So if you're at a place where you're not doing therapies, there's no kind of radiation therapy or anything like that, they may not establish a safety committee, but most hospitals will have one, especially if they're doing any kind of radiation therapy on site as well, or brachytherapy. So radiation protection program changes. A licensee may revise the radiation safety program without commission's approval if it does not require a license amendment, if the revision is in compliance with the regulations in the license, and the revision has been reviewed and approved by the radiation safety officer. So, and then it says the licensee shall retain a record. Remember, the licensee is the facility, not a single person. So it's really just saying that people can amend their radiation safety program. They can change their radiation safety manual and they can make small changes, but they need to keep a record of those changes. They don't necessarily have to notify the NRC every time that they like make a grammatic correction or change one thing within their radiation safety manual or program. And remember, your radiation safety manual is your written document that says how you run your radiation safety program. So if you kind of have to do what you are saying you're doing in your radiation safety manual. All right, so subpart C is the general technical requirements. This has to do with possession, use, and calibration of instruments used to measure the activity of byproduct material, calibration of survey instruments, determination of dosages, authorization for calibration, requirement for possession of sealed sources, labeling vials and syringes, surveys of ambient radiation exposure rate, the goes back to our daily surveys. Release of individuals containing unsealed byproduct material, that's the release of our therapy patients. Provisions of mobile medical service, and then decay and storage. So these general technical requirements in 10 CFR 35 Part C really have to do with making sure that all the equipment and things that we're using, it's kind of like the making sure that everything we're doing is calibrated, that it's referenced, that it's been measured. It's really just making sure of the technical side of things with our equipment and kind of things like that. So the first one is the possession, use, and calibration of instruments. And this talks about any instrument that's used for direct measurement. And then, so think about like your well counter, your uptake probe, your dose calibrator. And it says a licensee shall calibrate the instrumentation required in paragraph A of that section. And then licensee has to retain the records of each instrument calibration. So, licensee shall calibrate the survey instruments. This is 10 CFR 35.61, and it talks about the calibration of our survey instruments. So This is what tells us that not only do we have to do surveys every day, like 10 CFR 20 told us, but now 10 CFR 35 says we have to make sure that the instrument's working. So it has to be calibrated before use and annually, and then following any repair. So same things that we learned in instrumentation and some of your other classes. That survey meter is calibrated before use, annually, and then after repair. Needs to be calibrated on all scales, calibrated with 2 separate readings on each scale, and then conspicuously noted on the instrument the date of calibration. So remember, survey meters have that sticker on the side of them. That's why. It's because 10 CFR 35.61 says we have to. And then the licensee may not use survey instruments if the difference between the indicated exposure and calculated is more than 20%. So that's where it has to be within calibration, and we have to retain those records. And those records have to be kept for 3 years. Right, 10 CFR 35.63 is the determination of dosages of unsealed byproduct material. A licensee shall determine and record the activity of each dosage before medical use. This also applies to PET. And unit doses may be directly measured or decay correction applied. So if they were assayed at the nuclear pharmacy, that's what this unit dose is referring to, those would still have been assayed at the nuclear pharmacy. And so instead of putting those in a dose calibrator, you can measure them by using the decay correction. Of course, best practice is to use the dose calibrator because the pharmacies can make mistakes sometimes. But this regulation is just saying that all of those doses have to be measured before we give them to a patient, either by putting them in the dose calibrator or using what was on the sticker from the nuclear pharmacy and then applying the decay to the time that you use it. And then those records have to be, oh, the middle one here says that, you either have a prescribed dose or you have a prescribed range. If you have a prescribed range, it has to fall within that range. You can't have 20% of the range. It has to be within that range. And then if the dosage differs from the prescribed dose, if you have a prescribed dose, you can have 20%. So you can't use it if it's either outside of that range or outside of 20%, unless you have the authorized user sign off and write an order for that amount. So if I had a prescribed range of 28 to 32, it has to fall within 28 to 32. But if I have a prescribed dose of 30 millicuries, I technically have a wider range because I have 20% either way to work with. Technically go down from 24 to 36. But let's say I have a dose that I want to use for a stress test. The doctor was late, and now the dose is only 20 millicuries. The only way that I could still use that dose is if the authorized user makes a note and writes an order for that specific dose to be used at 20 millicuries. A licensee shall retain those records, and that's in accordance with another part, but those record keepings are all listed in 10 CFR 35.2063 or 20, but as you know, those need to be kept for 3 years. 10 CFR 35.65 is the calibration, transmission, and reference sources. So this regulation, it was what allows us to have sealed sources for QC, but then it has regulations for that. So the types and amounts of radioactivity are detailed in Appendix B of 10 CFR 30. So at the beginning where it referenced some of the other regulations, this is where 10 CFR 30 comes into play. But this is what allows us to have sealed sources, and then we also have to make sure that those are calibrated properly and things like that. So a licensee in possession of a sealed source or brachytherapy source has to follow specific safety and handling instructions that are supplied by the manufacturer. So this is where we have to do our leak tests. This says it has to be leak tested at least every 6 months. So twice a year, we have to do leak tests on all our sealed sources. And then to satisfy those leak test requirements, you should measure the sample in an instrument that can detect down to 0.005 microcuries. So really you need to test your all your leak test samples in a well counter. And then you have to keep those records for 3 years as well. If the leak test reveals that there's more than 0.005 microcuries or more of removable contamination, then you have to immediately withdraw that from use and either store, dispose, or cause it to be repaired. And then there's special requirements for that. You also have to file a report with the NRC within 5 days of the leak test. Now, if that you are in an agreement state, that might be slightly different. So pay close attention to that if you're in an agreement state. But for the NRC, needs to be filed within 5 days. And then you don't have to perform leak tests on some sources. If they are less than 100 microcuries, you don't have to leak test them. If they have a half-life of less than 30 days, if it's a gas. So we don't have to leak test xenon. We don't have to leak test our sealed sources that are less than 100 microcuries. That's why you will see for some of our like well counter and uptake probe, the QC sources are 99 microcuries. It's because we want them to be just under that. And then also, if it has a half-life of less than 30 days, you don't have to do a leak test on it. And of course, that makes sense because you're only leak testing them every 6 months. A licensee in possession of sealed sources shall conduct semi-annual physical inventory as well. So this is what tells us that twice a year you have to do inventory and leak testing. And then those records need kept for 3 years as well. 10 CFR 35.69 is what tells us that we have to label vials and syringes. So each syringe and vial that contains unsealed byproduct material must be labeled to identify it as a radioactive drug. So this is where you will see the radiation symbol on those. And each syringe shield and vial must also be labeled unless the label on the syringe or vial is visible. So if you have a vial and it's labeled properly, and then you put that into a vial shield or vial shield, then that still has to be labeled on the outside. You'll notice that our syringes that are in pigs, it's labeled on the syringe and it's labeled on the pig when it comes from the pharmacy. So all of those, it needs to be labeled on the actual container and then on whatever shielding it's in. 10 CFR 35.7 talks about surveys and ambient radiation exposure. So in addition to the surveys that were required in Part 20, a licensee shall survey with radiation detector survey instrument at the end of each day. So 10 CFR 20 told us that we had to do surveys to make sure that we're keeping the public dose safe, but it didn't tell us how frequently. So 10 CFR 35.70 says you have to do it at the end of each day. And that you should survey all areas where byproduct material requiring a written directive was prepared for use or administered. And then it says you do not need to perform the surveys where patients or human subjects were confined. And they cannot be released. So you would not have to go into an I-131 patient's room to survey their room at the end of the day, because you know that they're radioactive and so their room will be. But when you break down that room, you would have to survey it and decontaminate it and everything, but you wouldn't have to go in there every day. But to every other area where any radioactive material was used or stored, you need to do your daily surveys and then keep those records for 3 years. There is a provision here for medical mobile service, and this does apply to our mobile trailers. And basically, this says the same things apply to that. So you still have to do the survey meters and survey the area and things like that. Now for decay and storage, licensee may hold byproduct material with a natural half-life less than 120 days in storage for decay before disposal. Remember, this is the 10 half-life rule, so this is where that comes into play. You have to wait 10 half-lives. You still have to monitor it before disposal. So if you keep technetium for 60 days, you still have to monitor it before disposal, and it still has to be below background. That could have some molybdenum or something in it that is enough that it's still radioactive. And so you still have to dispose of it before you can throw it away. When you do go to destroy it or do go to dispose of it, you have to remove or destroy all the radiation labels. If you can't rip them off and take them off, then a lot of times people will just scribble them out and deface it with a black marker. And then those records need kept for 3 years as well. Unsealed byproduct material. This is when a written directive is not required. So these are all the parts. It has to do with the use of radiation for all of our diagnostic tests. And it talks about permissible molybdenum, strontium-82 and 85 concentrations, and training for imaging or localization studies. So this is the section that tells us a lot about what we're allowed to give patients, but 35.204 is where it tells us like our moly breakthrough and our strontium breakthrough limits for our generators. So, except for studies that require a written directive, a licensee may use any unsealed byproduct that is obtained from a manufacturer or preparer licensed under the same chapter. A PET radioactive drug producer prepared by an authorized nuclear pharmacist, or a physician who is an authorized user and meets the requirements to do so, or an authorized user under the supervision of the authorized nuclear pharmacist. And so there's some requirements there for where we can even get our doses from. So it can also be obtained from and prepared by the NRC or agreement state licensee for the use in research, or prepared by the licensee for use in research accordance with the Radioactive Drug Committee, an approved application or investigational new drug. So C and D are research, but A and B says we have to get our doses either from a manufacturer or prepared licensee that has a license to do that, and the NRC has given them permission, or the same for PET radionuclides. It has to be a nuclear pharmacist or physician, somebody that is approved by the NRC to do that. And then 10 CFR 35.19 has regulations for training, uptake, dilution, and excretion studies. This is where we have regulations that the licensee must require the authorized users to meet certain requirements. So use of unsealed byproduct material for imaging and localization studies for which a written directive is not required. This is the same as 10 CFR 35.10, and it delineates where and who you can receive your doses from. 10 CFR 35.2 has the permissible limits for strontium-82, 85, and molybdenum. So it says you cannot administer to humans any radiopharmaceutical that contains more than 0.15 microcuries of molybdenum per millicurie of TEC, more than 0.02 microcuries of strontium-85 per millicurie of rubidium, or more than 0.2 microcuries of strontium-85 per millicurie of rubidium-82. A licensee that uses molybdenum TEC generators must test this concentration of the first eluate after receipt of the generator. And then a licensee that uses the strontium rubidium generators shall test it before the first patient use of the day, measure the concentration of the radionuclides, and we've talked about the Bracco cart before and the JDI cart and how you do that QC on those rubidium generators. So those carts are kind of fail-safe, but they make you do it a certain way. And then if a licensee is required to measure the molybdenum concentration or the strontium, the licensee shall retain a record. So those records have to be kept for 3 years as well. 10 CFR 35.29 has the training for imaging and localization studies, and this is the same as what we've already discussed. 10 CFR 35 subpart E is where it talks about the written directives. Therapeutic doses greater than 30 microcuries require a written directive. And the written directive is the authorized user's written order for specific administration. It's basically the order for the therapy, but it's a little bit more than the order because it requires more information on it. It's usually the authorized user or the RSO physicist or dosimetrist who's taking care of that written order, and it has to be very specific to the patient and the dose and amount that they're getting. So 10 CFR 35.39 talks about experience and training for the authorized user. They have to be certified by a medical specialty board or completed 700 hours of clinical and classroom training with an authorized user, and they have to obtain a written attestation from an authorized user preceptor documenting specific experience and competencies. So F is the manual brachytherapy. We won't go into that a whole lot. Part G is sealed sources for diagnosis. We really don't use those. H is photon emitting remote afterloader units, so it doesn't really apply to us either. I and J are reserved, so that brings us to K, which is other medical uses of byproduct material or radiation from byproduct material. And this one states that a licensee may use byproduct material or radiation source approved by medical use, which is not specifically addressed in subparts D through F. So an applicant or licensee has submitted the information required, and the applicant or licensee has received approval from the commission in a license or licensee amendment and uses the material in accordance with the regulations. And this is a whole lot of record keeping. 10 CFR subpart L is just all of the record keeping. And I have a cheat sheet for that for you guys. So things that need kept for the length of the license are records of the radiation program duties and responsibilities and written directive procedures. Remember our dosimetry reports, if it's fetal monitoring or termination, that has to be kept that long also. Those are the only things. Radiation safety program changes have to be kept for 5 years. And then everything else in that section that's applicable to nuclear medicine only needs kept for 3 years. So if you're ever unsure, just guess 3 years, unless it has to do with therapy or termination badges. Other than that, you have a pretty good chance. Now, reports is covered in subpart M. This is report and notification of a medical event, report and notification of a dose to an embryo, fetus, or nursing child, and then report of a leaking source. Those are the ones that apply to us. And then subpart N is enforcement. This is what provides the criminal sanctions or willful violation. There's no need to memorize those or know those rules. Just know that that subpart exists in case you ever need to reference it. Now we'll talk about radiation safety and health physics. Remember, part 20 says we have to have a program, plan for review, and follow ALARA. And then 10 CFR 35 says that the RSO must implement the plan. The facility must give them the ability to implement the plan. Only authorized users requiring a written directive have to establish a safety committee. So it gets a little bit more detailed about that and even who's on the safety committee in 10 CFR 35. So a vital part of any nuclear medicine department that affects aspects of the department, patients, or employees make up the radiation safety program. It is really all encompassing anything that has to do with the radiation. Without a comprehensive, viable radiation safety program, nuclear medicine could not be practiced. And remember, the radiation safety manual is our written plan. So you have to stick to what's in your radiation safety manual. The radiation safety manual is what was submitted to the state or to the NRC as part of your application for your license. That's your agreement with the regulatory body saying these are the things that we are going to do, and this is how we're going to uphold and enforce the regulations. And so you have to stick with what's in your radiation safety manual. So the radiation safety program should be designed to ensure safety and control of the radioactive materials, control radiation exposure and control the non-controlled areas, provide adequate general protection, provide exposure monitoring. So all the information about dosimetry, internal, external, your ALARA 1 and 2 limits, the annual limits, how overexposures will be investigated. All of that stuff is included in the radiation safety program. So if the radiation safety manual says everybody who's over ALARA 1 has to have training and sign off on it, and then the RSO is not enforcing that, people are over ALARA 1 and nobody's doing anything and it's not documented, that's something you could get in trouble for when the inspectors come. Provide adequate radiation safety instrumentation, require and enforce proper training and practices, and ensure management involvement. Some things to consider when developing a radiation safety program: the scope of the program, any auxiliary support like health or medical physics, license conditions, the state regulations. Remember, if you're an agreement state, it has to be as strict or stricter than the NRC. And then institutional requirements. The personnel that are responsible for the radiation safety program, each employee uses radioactive materials, has a role, and the role of each individual will vary from facility to facility, and it will largely be based on the scope and complexity of what they're actually doing. It's going to be very different for a cardiology office who's just doing SPECT studies versus a large hospital that's doing PET and general nuclear medicine, has generators on site or their own nuclear pharmacy, and then maybe they even have a cyclotron, or they're doing therapies as well or doing research. So the role of every individual is going to differ based on the kind of institution that they're at, the kind of license they have, those types of things. The role of the nuclear medicine technologist is integral to all aspects of radiation safety. Typically, they are the ones who are performing the radiation safety duties and upholding the radiation safety program. The chief nuclear medicine technologist often develops, maintains, and enforces that radiation safety program in conjunction with the RSO. So personnel that are responsible for the radiation safety program are the Radiation Safety Committee and the RSO. Notice I didn't say authorized user, but that's because the authorized user is part of the Radiation Safety Committee, if there is one. So the Radiation Safety Committee and the RSO are really important personnel for enforcement of the radiation safety program. The training program in support of the radiation safety program should include every individual who may be involved with radiation. It may range in detail and length depending on the individuals, groups, or individuals being trained, and separate training modules should be developed for each target audience. So radiation safety training has to occur periodically, and that's anybody that has anything to do with the radiation safety program. So this is where nursing staff who are in the stress lab, the securities letting the nuclear pharmacy in the morning, they're responsible for the security of the radiation, at least when they're letting people in to the department. So anybody like that is has to be trained in radiation safety. Training and experience requirements are addressed in 10 CFR 35, starting in section 50 and extending through section 999. I'll save you from the gory details. Each licensee shall develop, document, and implement the radiation protection program. That's in 10 CFR 20. And this is where it says it has to follow ALARA principles. To implement ALARA requirements, a constraint of air emissions of radioactive material, excluding radon and its daughters, shall be established by licensees. And it states that the public dose should be kept below 10 millirems per year for all of those emissions. And again, that's in 10 CFR 20 again. But 10 CFR 35 talks about the authority and responsibilities for the program. So in addition to the protection program requirements in 10 CFR 20, request for a license application, renewal, or amendment must be is required and approved in writing before submittal to the commission. And any individual, before allowing the individual to work as an authorized user, pharmacist, or medical physicist, and the radiation protection program changes that do not require a license amendment are permitted. So that's telling you a lot about the authority and responsibilities of the radiation safety program. A licensee's management shall appoint a radiation safety officer who agrees in writing. And then for up to 60 days each year, a licensee could permit an authorized user or an individual qualified to be an RSO to function as a temporary RSO. So if the RSO goes on vacation, then they can have someone who fill in for them. Licensee may simultaneously appoint more than one temporary radiation safety officer, and a licensee shall establish the authority, duties, and responsibilities of the RSO in writing. Licensees that are authorized for 2 or more different types of byproduct material must establish a radiation safety committee. And then again, this is in part 35 where it tells us it has to be an authorized user, radiation safety officer, representative from nursing, representative from management, and then they can also appoint whoever they consider appropriate. And like I said, that is usually representatives of each diagnostic modality, but not always. So this is, remember we talked about this in part 35 where it says that the facility has to give the RSO the ability to do their job. And they have to keep records of any actions taken under that section. And that's typically for 3 years. If they made changes to the Radiation Safety Committee, though, that is for 5 years. So Radiation Safety Committee, the tasks and responsibilities are detailed in 10 CFR 35, but they are tasked with assisting the RSO in developing new policies, advising the RSO on technical matters, reviewing and approving uses of radioactive material, reviewing and the quarterly and annual reports that the RSO provides to them on the radiation safety program, ensure compliance with all applicable regulations in the administrative code, and then auditing the RSO annually. And remember, when you have a radiation safety committee, there have to be at least 50 members present for there to be a quorum. And meetings are usually held monthly, but they need to be held at least quarterly. Radiation safety officer is typically a health physicist or a medical physicist. In some agreement states, they will allow a nuclear medicine technologist to be an RSO, but the NRC does not allow that. So it depends on what kind of state you are in. Every radioactive material license must list an RSO and must meet the training requirements that are listed in 10 CFR 35. These are the duties of the RSO: investigate overexposures and radiation accidents, establish and enforce written policies and procedures for purchasing, receipt, and opening, storage, inventory, use and disposal, and the equipment QC. Training requirements for the radiation safety officer are found in 10 CFR 35. So these are the NRC regulations. Other regulations in 10 CFR for nuclear medicine, Part 21, 30, 31, 33, 40, 70, and 71. We already talked about 71. The rest of them are really minor. They just kind of expand on things that were in the other ones. The main ones that you need to know are 19, 20, 35, and 71. 10 CFR 21 has guidelines for reporting of defects and non-compliance. So this section just requires any individual director or responsible officer to immediately notify to the commission, to the NRC, failures to comply. And that has to do with facility, activity, or basic component, and activity or basic component supplied to such facility or activity containing defects. Really wordy. But it's something that anything that would create a substantial safety hazard based on non-compliance to the regulations, it just kind of requires any individual that sees that to report it. So 10 CFR 30 has rules for general applicability to domestic licensing of byproduct material, prescribes rules applicable to everybody in the United States governing domestic licensing and byproduct, talks about employee rights, the application process, how to amend a license, and exempted concentrations. So there's a link right here to the schedule of exempted quantities. So 10 CFR 30 is where you would have the exempted quantities that tell you things that could be shipped with that UN 2910 label instead of the white 1, yellow 2, yellow 3. So 10 CFR Part 31 establishes general licenses for the provision and use of byproduct material. Part 33 has specific domestic licenses for broad scope. These are the places that are really large that have, they do a lot of things and they're usually doing research. So this is just kind of a breakdown of 10 CFR 33 where it talks about the different types of licenses or different types of broad scope licenses. And that doesn't really apply to us a whole lot unless you're going to be at a very large institution that does a lot of stuff. These would be places that are developing new pet radiopharmaceuticals and things like that. So they may be using like zirconium or radioactive zinc or radioactive lead or radioactive gold, and they're using that and trying to develop new radiopharmaceuticals. Those are the type of people that need a broader scope license because they're doing a lot more and they're using things that we don't normally use on our license. 10 CFR Part 40 has to do with procedures and criteria for the issuance of licenses to receive Title II, receive, possess, use, transport, or deliver sources. This establishes procedures and criteria for the issuance of licenses to receive Title II, own, acquire, deliver, receive, possess, blah, blah, blah. The terms and conditions upon which the commission will issue licenses. So it's really just talking about domestic use of nuclear material. 10 CFR 70, subpart C, talks about the types of general licenses. So one thing I want to note is it has the type of licenses there and then also licenses for calibration or reference sources. You need a license to be able to do that. License to possess special nuclear material for transport. License for carriers of transient shipments. So there's lots of different types of licenses for facilities or for companies, not just the nuclear medicine license that you guys have been taught about. Now we're going to talk about the DOT regulations briefly. The DOT regulations set regulations for the safe use, transport of radioactive materials. And this is a memorandum of understanding or an MOU with the NRC. And it sets guidelines for shipment and receipt of radioactive materials. There are several different DOT regulations based on the UN classification of what is being shipped. The Class 7 is the radioactive materials, and that's why when you look at shipping play cards that require like a transport index or whatever, you'll see the number 7 on there. That's telling whoever is identifying that that is radioactive materials. So 10 CFR Part 71 has to do with the packaging and transportation of radioactive material. So this part establishes the requirements for packaging, preparation for shipment, and transportation. Procedures and standards for the NRC approval of packaging and shipping. Procedures for fissile material and for a quantity of other licensed material in excess of type A quantities. And then a licensee transporting licensed material or delivering licensed material to the carrier for transport has to comply with those regulations. So basically, you just have to follow them. Each licensee who transports licensed material outside of the site of usage, as specified by the NRC license, has to follow these regulations. So everybody that's moving them. And this is important to note because you can't, if you are working on, let's say, an outpatient clinic that's down the street from a hospital, you can't just put that material in your car and drive it there. That's because you're not following the DOT regulation. So that's kind of a big deal. Don't do that. Licensees shall particularly note DOT regulations in the following areas: packaging, marking and labeling, play carding, accident reporting, shipping papers and emergency information, hazardous material training for personnel, security plans, and then shipper and carrier registration. Those are all found in 49 CFR, various parts, 171 to 173, basically, for the most part. And 10 CFR 71 refers to that. So 49 CFR parts, whatever, that's where you actually find the Department of Transportation regulations. NRC regulations are in 10 CFR, and so that's why it's different. But because we have that memorandum of understanding, it references the DOT regulations pretty frequently. In 10 CFR 71, it states that the licensee shall also note DOT regulations pertaining to the following modes of transportation: air, rail, vessel, or public highway. If the DOT regulations are not applicable to a shipment, the licensee shall conform to the standards and requirements of the DOT that's specified in that paragraph. So there is an exemption for low-level materials. So we have exempted quantity packages. Licensee is exempt from all requirements of that part with respect to shipment or carriage of the following packages, and it's a package that contains no more than a type A quantity of radioactive material, a package transported within the United States that contains no more than 20 curies of special form plutonium-244, it's oddly specific, or the package that contains an LSA or SCO radioactive material provided. Just to refresh you, the LSA is low specific activity and SCO is surface contaminated. So if it contains only a surface contaminated or a low specific activity, it's exempt from that. So these are the general standards for all packages. Smallest overall dimension of a package may not be less than 10 centimeters, that's 4 inches. Outside of a package must incorporate a feature such as a seal that is not readily breakable, and while intact would be evidence that the package has not been opened, so needs to be sealed. Each package must include a containment system securely closed by a positive fastening device and cannot be opened unintentionally. So there is contamination, it's contained. Package must be made of materials and construction that assure that there will be no significant reaction among the packaging components. A package valve or device, the failure of which would allow radioactive contents to escape. So both of those bullet points are just saying that you have to make sure that if there is a kind of protect it from getting spilled, but make sure if there is a spill, it will be contained. And the package must be designed, constructed, and prepared for shipment so that under the test specified of normal conditions of transport, there will be no loss or dispersal of radioactive contents. So we got to make sure that, the last bullet point kind of goes in with that too, making sure that it can withstand air of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the shade, no accessible surface of the package will have a temperature exceeding 122 degrees Fahrenheit or 185 degrees Fahrenheit in the exclusive use of the shipment. So all of those bullet points are just making sure that it's not going to have some kind of reaction in transport, and if it does have any kind of leakage, it will be contained. And then package may not incorporate a feature that allows it to vent into the air. We definitely don't. So 10 CFR 71, and this is also in the DOT regulations, but radiation levels cannot exceed 200 millirems per hour at the surface at any point, and the transport index cannot exceed 10. Remember, the transport index is the reading at 1 meter. And so the transport index, the reading at 1 meter cannot exceed 10, and the surface cannot exceed 200. If either one of those is met, it cannot be transported. There are some exemptions to that though. If it's secured in a contained transport with no loading and unloading, the outer surface of the vehicle does not exceed 200 at the surface. The outer lateral surfaces of the vehicle cannot exceed the transport index, and then it cannot exceed 2 millirems per hour in any occupied space. So if it's loaded on a truck and that driver is not going to be exposed to more than 2 MR per hour. If the vehicle does not exceed 10 MR per hour, or the outer surface of the trailer does not exceed 200, then it may still be able to be transported. Now, 10 CFR 71 is where we have our guidelines for opening a package, but it's also in 10 CFR 20. Remember, when you're opening a package, you always approach it from the outside in. You want to know, is it okay at 1 meter? And then you say, okay, is it okay at the surface? Is it okay to touch it? Is it okay to open it? So you work from the outside in. Those records have to be kept for 3 years. That's in 10 CFR 71. And the records that you keep have to have the package information and contents, serial number of the survey instruments that were used, the date, time, initials of the recipient, and the results of the surveys. And then subpart H in this refers to the radiation safety program and protocol for shipping and receiving. So your radiation safety manual and program will have instructions and guidelines for how packages are opened and stored and shipped and returned within your department. Remember, the DOT regulations classify radioactive materials under class 7. And so if you look at those play cards, you'll see a 7 at the bottom in the bottom of the diamond. Remember, you have a white radioactive 1, yellow 2, and yellow 3. White radioactive 1 is the lowest level. That one does not require a transport index because it should be background at 1 meter, but it does still need to include the contents and the activity. But yellow 2 and yellow 3 have a transport index box on them that must be filled out. That's that reading at 1 meter. And so it's important to have that. And you have to survey it at 1 meter. That should be at or below the transport index before you proceed to surveying it at the surface. The DOT and the NRC co-regulate the transportation of radioactive materials. The DOT adopts the regulations for all shippers and carriers of hazardous materials, including shipping and receiving radioactive materials. So the NRC developed the safety standards for packaging certain materials, and it regulates the licensees. And then the International Atomic Energy Agency has adopted the international regulations for safe transportation. As a member state, the United States, through the DOT and the NRC, has amended its domestic regulations to make it compatible for that. And that's how we're able to ship radioactive materials internationally. 10 CFR Part 71 has to do with the transportation of licensed material. And the DOT hazmat refresher training requirement is that should be done annually. So this is where it talks about the hazmat training and the that refresher training is something that should be done annually. The DOT labels must be printed on or affixed to the surface of the package. It needs to be located on the same surface of the package or near the proper shipping name marking if the package dimensions are adequate. And except as provided in that section, duplicate labeling is not required on a package or containment surface, such as to satisfy redundant labeling requirements. You'll notice that our packages that we get from the pharmacy do have labels on both sides. And again, there's what our labels look like. And these are the limits at the surface of each one. It's very important that you guys know this. White 1 at the surface needs to be less than 0.5 MR per hour. And at 1 meter, it should be reading the same as background. Yellow 2 is between 0.5 and 50 at the surface. And at 1 meter, it should be less than 1. A yellow 3 could be anywhere from 50 to 200 at the surface. And then it needs to be somewhere between 1 and 10 at 1 meter. And remember, if it's over 10 at 1 meter or over 200 at the surface, it shouldn't really exceed that. There are some exemptions to it, but you're not going to really see that in nuclear medicine, at least not hopefully. So, and then the transport index, remember, is the reading at 1 meter. Keep in mind it has to fall within both. And so if you have a package that is reading 1 or let's say 0.9 as the transport index, but it's reading 53 at the surface, it should be a yellow 3. If it exceeds either one of those, then it needs to fall to the next level. And this is just showing you the classification of each of those before, or each of these labels again. And then standard size for these play cards or these signs is 4 by 4 inches. And one thing I want to point out is the empty at the bottom. So this is applied to packages that have been emptied of their contents. And this is what we use when we ship back to the pharmacy. We have to switch that over. So make sure you have to switch it over and label it as empty. The exemption to that is accepted packages. Those accepted packages are ones that fall within the limits to be low enough that they're not going to register even as a white 1. Those are things like our QC sources that are 99 microcuries. Those are ones that would be exempted quantities, and the label for that is UN 2910. That's important to remember. Those are just accepted packages. They're the exception to the rule. They're so low level radiation that they don't require a white 1, but they still need to have that label on it showing that they are radiation. It's just a low level of it. And here's a picture of a package that has that UN label on it. Don't forget USP 797 and 825. 797 talks about pharmaceutical compounding, and then 825 talks about what we do in the department when we're cooking eggs or labeling blood. One thing I want to remind you though is that the USP is the United States Pharmacopoeia. They are not a regulating body. They are they just make recommendations for best practice. They oversee pharmacy boards and things like that. They don't really oversee them, but they make recommendations to pharmacy boards and things like that. So those are the two sections that really impact us. 797 doesn't even really impact us that much. It impacts pharmacies. And then 825 does impact our ability to tag blood, make eggs, things like that, or compound radiopharmaceuticals within the nuclear medicine department. Right, so the daily operations of a nuclear pharmacy include receiving radioactive materials, preparing the radiopharmaceuticals, quality control tests, storage, dispensing, radioactive waste disposal, as well as infectious waste disposal, daily calibrating or daily QC, and that includes the dose calibrator, survey meters, and well counters, as well as the thyroid uptake probe. Technologist guidelines, you must wear gloves and you're supposed to use a lab coat when handling radioactive materials. Tongs are used if it's a high activity, and you should always operate behind a lead shield. Monitoring hands, feet, and the area for contamination should happen on a regular basis. And you are not supposed to eat, store food, drink, smoke, or apply makeup where licensed material is stored. And they tell you, don't even bring it. You should not be applying your makeup in the hot lab. Or just hanging out and having a pizza party in the hot lab is also frowned upon. Technologist guidelines also include wearing your personal monitoring devices. That includes your ring badge and your whole body badge. And this part of the ring badge that has, there's like a little chip behind it, that's where your actual dosimeter is. So that white part should actually be facing in. It's a little backwards than how you think, how we normally wear rings. Store uh, in low level or low background areas and wear your extremity dosimeters and then dispose radioactive waste properly in the designed, labeled, and shielded receptacles. So make sure with your badges that you're storing them outside of the department if possible. If you can't store them outside of the department, then they should at least be stored in low background areas, not in the hot lab. Daily survey areas of licensed material use. This would include generator storage if you have one, any kit prep area if there is, injection areas, prep and administration areas of therapy. The exception to that is the patient rooms while their patients are in them. If it's necessary, if you find any contamination, decontaminate it and record that. Store radioactive solutions in shielded and labeled areas and properly labeled diagnostic and therapy multi-dose vials. It's also important that you label syringes and unit doses with the name of the radioactivity, the activity present, the date and time of assay, the type of material that it is or the radiopharmaceutical, exam type, and patient name. You don't always have to include the patient name or the exam type, but that is best practice if you have it. Before administration, assay each patient dose. When assaying, you don't need to worry about the radioactivity in the sides, hub, or the needle. We don't account for that. Do not use it if doses do not fall within the prescribed dose range or they vary more than 20% of a prescribed dose, unless it's been approved by the authorized user in writing. And that concludes our review of radiation safety regulations. Keep calm and practice ALARA. Thank you guys for watching.